He slid the divorce papers across the birthday cake like it was just another bill to sign. The candles were still lit when Daniel Carter did it, small flames flickering in the soft light of the dining room while 20 guests sat around the long oak table pretending not to understand what they were seeing, the smell of vanilla frosting and warm sugar hanging in the air. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke because the scene didn't fit the occasion, not the gold balloons tied to the chairs, not the happy 50th banner stretched across the wall, not the half-filled glasses of champagne raised mid-celebration, and yet there it was, a thick cream-colored envelope placed directly in front of Evelyn Carter, just inches from her untouched slice of cake, her name written neatly across the front in Daniel's precise handwriting, as if he had prepared this carefully, as if this had been planned down to the smallest detail. And Daniel didn't look angry, didn't look nervous, he looked calm, almost relieved, like a man finally crossing something off a long-standing to-do list. His cufflinks catching the light as he leaned back slightly in his chair, giving her space, giving the moment room to settle, and when he spoke, his voice was even, controlled, the same tone he used in board meetings and contract negotiations. "You should read it now," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the people closest to them heard every word, and that was enough because silence spreads quickly in a room like that, one conversation stopping, then another, until the entire table fell into a quiet so complete that the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became noticeable. And Evelyn didn't look up right away, she didn't ask what it was, didn't question him, she simply lowered her eyes to the envelope, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, steady, composed, as if this were just another document among hundreds she had handled over the years. And in a way it was, because for 25 years, Evelyn had been the one behind the scenes, organizing, reviewing, correcting, making sure everything in Daniel's world functioned the way it was supposed to. The kind of work no one applauds because no one notices it until it's gone. And across the table, someone cleared their throat quietly. Another guest shifted in their seat, a fork touched a plate with a soft clink, small sounds that felt too loud in the stillness, and then Daniel added, almost as an afterthought, "It's straightforward," he said. "Everything's already arranged." And there was something in the way he said it, something final, something that suggested this decision had been made long before tonight. Long before the candles were lit and the guests arrived with wrapped boxes and polite smiles. And finally, Evelyn reached for the envelope, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time had slowed just for her, her thumb sliding under the sealed flap, the paper making a soft tearing sound as she opened it, and still she said nothing, her expression unchanged, calm, almost distant, like someone observing a scene rather than standing at the center of it. And Daniel watched her closely now, not with concern but with expectation. Like he was waiting for a reaction that would confirm something he already believed. And around them, the room held its breath because everyone understood, even without reading a single word, that whatever was inside that envelope had just turned a birthday celebration into something else entirely, something colder, something that wouldn't be undone. And Evelyn pulled the papers free, the crisp pages catching the light as she glanced down at the first line, her name, his name, the word dissolution printed in formal, legal language, and for a brief moment, just a second, her fingers paused against the edge of the page, but her face didn't change, not even slightly, and when she finally looked up, it wasn't at Daniel, it was at the candles still burning in front of her, wax beginning to drip slowly down the sides, time moving forward whether anyone was ready or not. And she understood something then, something quiet and clear. This wasn't a mistake, it wasn't impulsive, it was intentional, precise, and most importantly, incomplete. But Daniel didn't know that yet. Daniel did not rush her, which was the first thing that felt deliberate, almost calculated, as if he had rehearsed this moment enough times to understand that silence would do more work than any argument ever could. And Evelyn noticed that, the way he leaned back slightly, giving her space not out of respect but out of confidence, like a man who believed the outcome was already decided, and around them the room remained suspended in that uncomfortable stillness, the kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing, their own hands, unsure of where to look. And one of the guests, a woman from Daniel's firm, reached for her glass of champagne and then stopped halfway, setting it back down without taking a sip, because drinking felt inappropriate, like applauding at the wrong moment. And Evelyn lowered her gaze again to the document, her eyes moving steadily across the lines, not skimming, not hesitating, actually reading, which Daniel had not expected because to him this was a formality, a conclusion, not something that required attention. And yet she read every word, the division of assets, the property allocations, the clauses written in tight legal language designed to sound neutral but shaped with intention. and she could see the pattern immediately. The way everything was structured to appear fair on the surface while quietly shifting control in one direction. His direction, and it was almost impressive, the effort behind it, the months it must have taken, the consultations, the revisions, the confidence it required to present it like this on this night in front of these people. And when she reached the section about the house, the one they had lived in for over 2 decades, the one she had furnished, maintained, paid for in ways that never showed up on paper, her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second, but her expression remained unchanged. Calm, distant, controlled, and Daniel mistook that for acceptance, which was his second mistake, because he had always believed that silence meant agreement, that her lack of resistance over the years had been a sign of weakness rather than choice. And across the table, someone shifted again, a chair leg scraping lightly against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp in the quiet, and another guest glanced toward the doorway, as if considering leaving, but no one moved, because leaving would mean acknowledging what was happening, and acknowledging it would make it real. And Evelyn turned the page slowly, the paper making a soft, deliberate sound, and she noticed something else then, something smaller, more subtle, a clause near the end, written in standard language, almost routine, something most people would overlook, something Daniel clearly had, because it did not fit the narrative he believed he was controlling. And her eyes lingered there for a moment longer than necessary, not because she needed time to understand it, but because she was confirming something she already suspected. And then she looked up, not at the guests, not at the room, but directly at Daniel, her gaze steady, unreadable, and for the first time that evening, he hesitated, just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he smoothed it away, replacing it with that same composed confidence. And he gave a small nod, as if encouraging her to continue, to finish what he had started, and Evelyn said nothing, not yet, because words would come later, and when they did, they would matter more, and instead, she reached for the pen placed neatly beside the cake, the one someone had used earlier to write names on gift tags, and she picked it up without asking, without announcing anything, her movements precise, controlled, and a quiet ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, as people realized what she was about to do, and Daniel straightened slightly in his chair, his shoulders relaxing, the tension easing from his posture, because this was the moment he had been waiting for, the confirmation, the final step, and he believed, completely, that he understood what it meant. But Evelyn did not look at him again, not as she positioned the paper, not as she placed the tip of the pen against the line where her name was printed, not as she held it there for a brief second, long enough for the room to register the weight of the moment, and then without hesitation, without a single question, she signed. The sound of the pen against paper was softer than anyone expected, a faint scratch that seemed to echo more than it should in the quiet room, and when Evelyn finished writing her name, she did not rush to move the page away, she did not slide it back across the table, she simply set the pen down exactly where she had found it, parallel to the edge of the plate, as if maintaining order mattered even now, and for a moment, no one reacted, because the simplicity of what she had just done did not match the weight of it, and Daniel let out a slow breath he had been holding, his shoulders dropping slightly, the tension leaving his posture in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it, and Evelyn noticed because she always noticed the small things, the details people revealed without meaning to, and she understood what that breath meant. It meant relief, it meant confirmation, it meant he believed the outcome was now fixed, and that belief settled into him quickly, reshaping the way he sat, the way he looked at her, no longer watching for resistance but already moving on, already thinking ahead. And that was his third mistake, because he stopped paying attention too soon, and across the table, someone finally shifted enough to break the stillness, a quiet cough, a chair adjusting, the faint clink of glass as a guest picked up their drink again, unsure but compelled to return to normal, because people prefer the familiar, even when the moment demands something else. And Daniel reached forward, his hand extending toward the signed document, but Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paper, not gripping it, not pulling it away, just enough to pause him, and he looked at her then, a small flicker of confusion crossing his face, not irritation, not yet, just a question he had not expected to need to ask, and Evelyn met his gaze calmly, her expression unchanged, her voice when it came was quiet, steady, the kind of tone that did not need volume to carry. "You should read the last page," she said, not as a suggestion, not as a challenge, simply as a statement, and for a second Daniel did not respond, because the request did not fit his understanding of the moment. He had already read the document, or at least he believed he had approved it, discussed it, signed his part of it days ago, and to him this was done, finished, but there was something in the way she said it, something that did not match the role he had assigned her in this situation, and he hesitated just briefly before pulling the papers closer, his eyes moving quickly at first, scanning, confirming what he already knew: the asset divisions, the accounts, the property, everything in its place, everything aligned with the plan he had built, and then his gaze slowed almost imperceptibly as he reached the final section, the part most people overlook, the part written in language designed to blend in, and Evelyn watched him without moving, without interrupting. Because this was the moment that mattered, not the signing, not the silence, but the understanding that would come after, and around them, the room shifted again, conversation starting in low murmurs, uncertain, cautious, as if people were testing whether it was safe to speak, but their voices remained distant, background noise to something far more precise unfolding at the center of the table, and Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from across the room, but subtly, a tightening around his eyes, a slight stillness in his posture, the kind of reaction that only someone paying close attention would notice, and Evelyn noticed, because she had been paying attention for years, and she said nothing because she did not need to, because the paper in his hands was already doing that for her. And for the first time that evening, Daniel did not look like a man who had finished something. He looked like a man who had just realized he might have missed something important, something that had been there all along, waiting, quiet, patient, exactly like her. Daniel read the last page again, slower this time, his eyes no longer moving with the casual certainty of someone confirming a decision, but with the careful focus of someone trying to understand what he had missed. And the room around them continued its quiet, uneasy return to motion, soft conversations resuming in fragments, silverware lightly touching plates, the low hum of people pretending that nothing unusual was happening. But at the center of the table, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Evelyn remained still, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly in her lap now, no longer touching the document, because she did not need to hold it anymore. It was already where it needed to be, and Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper as he reached the clause again, the one written in standard legal phrasing, easy to overlook, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. And this time, he did not skim it, he read each word, each line, the language precise, deliberate, binding, and for a moment, his expression did not change, because understanding often arrives quietly before it shows itself. And then it happened, a subtle pause in his breathing, a slight stillness in his shoulders, the kind of reaction that comes not from surprise, but from realization, and he looked up at her again, not with confidence this time, but with something else, something closer to calculation, as if trying to reassess the situation, trying to determine whether what he was seeing meant what he thought it meant. And Evelyn met his gaze calmly, her eyes steady, her expression composed, offering no explanation, no clarification, because she knew that explaining would only reduce the moment. And this was not a moment that needed words, and Daniel glanced back down at the page, his thumb pressing lightly against the margin as if grounding himself in something tangible. And the clause remained exactly what it was, unchanged, undeniable, a condition tied to signatures, to acknowledgments, to actions taken willingly and without coercion, and more importantly, a condition that had been activated the moment both parties signed, and he had signed days ago, confident, unquestioning, and Evelyn had just completed the process quietly, publicly, without resistance, and that was when the full weight of it settled in, not all at once but in layers, each realization building on the last, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, not in the relaxed way he had earlier, but in a way that created distance, as if space might give him clarity, and across the table, one of the guests laughed softly at something unrelated, the sound out of place, almost jarring because it belonged to a different moment, a different reality, and Daniel's attention snapped briefly toward the noise before returning to the paper, and then to Evelyn, and for the first time that evening, he spoke her name, not as a statement, not as a command, but as a question he did not yet know how to ask. "Evelyn," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, and she tilted her head slightly, acknowledging him without offering more, maintaining that same controlled stillness that had defined her from the beginning of the night, and he hesitated, searching for the right words, the right angle, something that would restore the balance he believed he had already secured, but nothing came easily, because the structure he had relied on had shifted, quietly, precisely, and without warning, and Evelyn let the silence stretch just a moment longer before speaking, her voice even measured. "It is standard language," she said, as if clarifying something simple, something obvious, and then after a brief pause, unless you understand how it is used. And she did not elaborate further, did not explain the implications because she did not need to. The document was already doing that work, and Daniel looked back down once more, his eyes scanning the clause again, this time not for confirmation but for escape, for interpretation, for any detail that might give him control back. But the words remained fixed, and for the first time he was the one catching up, the one trying to understand a situation that had already moved beyond him. And Evelyn sat quietly, composed, watching, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was not the moment everything changed, it was the moment everything finally revealed itself. Daniel did not speak immediately after that, and that silence, the one that followed her words, felt different from the earlier ones, heavier, more deliberate, because it no longer belonged to her, it belonged to him, and he was not used to carrying it. Not in this way, not without control, and his eyes moved once more across the page, slower now, tracing the lines as if repetition might change their meaning, but nothing shifted, nothing softened. The language remained exactly what it was, clear, binding, and structured in a way that did not favor assumption, only outcome, and he placed the document flat on the table this time, smoothing it with his palm, a subtle attempt to regain composure, to create order where something had just come undone, and when he looked up again, his expression had changed, not dramatically but enough, the confidence still there but now tempered with something sharper, more cautious, as if he had realized he was no longer the only one who understood what was happening. And across from him, Evelyn remained composed, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, offering nothing beyond what had already been said, and that absence of reaction began to work against him, because without resistance, there was nothing to push against, nothing to correct, nothing to dominate, only space, and in that space realization had room to grow. And one of the guests nearby attempted to fill the tension with a quiet comment about the cake. Something light, something neutral, but it faded quickly, swallowed by the atmosphere at the table, because even those who did not understand the details could sense the shift, the imbalance, the moment when something expected had turned into something else entirely. And Daniel reached for his glass of water, taking a small sip, not because he was thirsty, but because it gave him a second, a pause, a way to delay what came next. And when he set the glass down, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, keeping the conversation contained to the space between them. "This does not change anything," he said, the words measured, controlled, but not as certain as before, and Evelyn listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, almost patient, as if she had anticipated this exact response. And she let a brief silence pass before answering, not to challenge him, but to correct the assumption. "It changes what you thought you secured," she said quietly, and the distinction was small but precise, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation, because he was beginning to understand that this was not about disagreement, it was about definition, about what had been assumed versus what was actually in place. And he glanced again at the final page, his finger tapping lightly once against the margin, a small, controlled movement, as if grounding himself in the physical presence of the document. And across the table, Evelyn shifted just enough to reach for her glass, lifting it with steady hands, taking a small sip of champagne that had long since gone warm. The bubbles softened, the taste slightly flat, and she set it back down with the same care she had used for everything else that evening. And the normalcy of that gesture, the simplicity of it, contrasted sharply with the complexity unfolding between them. And Daniel noticed that too, the way she moved without urgency, without hesitation, as if she were not reacting to the situation, but moving within it on her own terms, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else, because it suggested something he had not accounted for, something he had overlooked, and for the first time, he asked a question he had not prepared. "When did you see this?" he said, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something closer to concern than curiosity. And Evelyn met his gaze again, her answer immediate, unforced. "Before you brought it tonight," she said, and she did not elaborate, did not explain how, because the answer itself was enough. It shifted the timeline, redefined the sequence of events, turned what he believed was a surprise into something anticipated, something already considered, and that changed everything, not just the document, not just the outcome, but the balance of the entire evening. And Daniel leaned back again, this time slower, more deliberate. The confidence he had carried into the room no longer sitting as easily on him, because now he understood something he had not before. He had not been leading this moment, he had been walking into it. Daniel did not respond right away after she said that, and that was new because for years he had always had an answer ready, always had a way to steer a conversation back into territory he controlled, but now he was quiet, not the calm silence he had used earlier, not the kind that carried confidence. This was different. This was the kind that forms when the structure underneath a plan begins to shift, and Evelyn watched him without expression, without pressure, because she did not need to push. The moment was already moving in her direction, and around them, the room had fully resumed its low, uncertain rhythm, voices returning in cautious tones, forks moving again, glasses lifting, but every so often, someone would glance toward their end of the table, drawn back by something they could not quite name, something unresolved, and Daniel noticed those glances, the way attention drifted back to him, and it irritated him, not because of what they saw, but because he could not control what they were beginning to sense, and he leaned forward slightly again, lowering his voice further, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "That does not matter," he said, trying to reframe it, trying to reduce what she had just said to something insignificant. "The agreement is clear." And Evelyn gave a small nod, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because the statement itself was not incorrect. It was simply incomplete, and she let a second pass before answering, her voice steady, almost conversational. "It is clear," she said. "That is why it works." And the way she said it, the lack of emphasis, the absence of explanation, made it land harder than if she had argued, because it suggested that the clarity he relied on was the very thing that had undone him. And Daniel's fingers pressed lightly against the table now, a subtle shift, a physical response he did not fully control, and he glanced again at the last page, then back at her, searching, recalculating, trying to piece together what he had missed, and the timeline kept returning to him, the sequence of events, when he had reviewed the document, when he had approved it, when he had signed it, and now, when she had signed it, and the realization that she had seen it before. Tonight continued to settle deeper, changing the meaning of everything that had happened since he walked into the room, and Evelyn remained still, allowing that realization to unfold without interruption, because timing mattered, not just what was revealed, but when it was allowed to be understood, and she reached for the edge of her plate, gently sliding it an inch to the side, a small, precise movement, creating space in front of her as if clearing the table for something else, and Daniel noticed that too, the way she adjusted her space without asking, without signaling, simply acting, and it reinforced what he was beginning to understand, that she was not reacting to his decision, she was operating within her own, and that realization carried weight, because it meant he had misread not just the situation, but her. And across the table, someone stood briefly to refill a drink, the chair scraping softly, the normal sounds of a dinner continuing around a moment that was anything but normal. And Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his posture no longer relaxed but measured, as if he were trying to maintain control through stillness, and he exhaled quietly, his gaze dropping to the document once more, not searching now but confirming. And when he looked up again, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The confidence was no longer complete. It had fractured just enough to reveal something underneath, something more cautious, more aware. And he spoke again, this time more carefully. "What exactly do you think this changes?" he asked, and it was the first honest question he had asked that evening, not rhetorical, not controlled but real. And Evelyn met his eyes, her answer coming without hesitation, not louder, not sharper, just precise. "Not what I think," she said, "what it already did." And she let that sit there unexpanded, because the answer was not something she needed to explain, it was something he needed to understand. And the difference between those two things was where the power had shifted, quietly, completely, and without him realizing it until now. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, as if expecting more, as if waiting for her to fill in the gap she had deliberately left open, but she did not, and that absence forced him to return to the document again, not out of habit this time but necessity. And he picked it up once more, the paper no longer just a formality in his hands, but something heavier, something that required attention he had not given it before. And he turned to the final section again, slower now, his eyes tracing each line carefully, not scanning, not assuming, actually reading. And as he did, the structure began to reveal itself in a way it had not earlier, because now he was looking for it. Now he was trying to understand what had already been set in motion, and Evelyn watched quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not pressing him, not guiding him, because she knew that realization, when it comes on its own, carries more weight than anything explained. And around them, the room continued its quiet attempt to normalize, a low hum of conversation, a few cautious laughs, the faint clink of utensils against plates, but those sounds felt distant, like they belonged to another space entirely, and at their end of the table, everything remained precise, contained and focused, and Daniel's expression shifted again, more noticeably this time, not dramatically but enough, the tightening around his eyes deepening. His mouth setting into a firmer line, because what he was seeing was no longer ambiguous, no longer something that could be dismissed as a minor detail, and he lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lifting to meet hers again, and there was a question there now, not spoken but present, and Evelyn let the silence hold for just a moment longer before speaking, her voice calm, measured. "You assumed it was protection," she said, not accusing, not correcting, simply stating, and Daniel did not respond immediately, because that was exactly what he had assumed, that the clause existed to protect the structure he had built, to secure his position, to finalize the division in his favor, and that assumption had guided everything, from the way the document was drafted to the way it was presented tonight, and Evelyn continued, not raising her voice, not shifting her tone. "It is conditional," she said, and the word settled between them, precise, unavoidable, and Daniel's grip on the paper tightened slightly again, because he understood that word, understood what it implied, but had not applied it correctly, not in this context, and she added after a brief pause, "And conditions work both ways." And that was the moment it aligned, not all at once but clearly enough that he could no longer ignore it. The clause was not anchored to ownership, not fixed in the way he had believed. It was tied to execution, to the completion of the agreement, to the acknowledgement of terms under specific conditions, and those conditions had just been met, publicly, willingly, and without dispute, and he had participated in that process fully without questioning it, and the realization settled into him in layers, each one removing a piece of the certainty he had carried into the room. And he leaned back slowly, the document still in his hand, but no longer held with confidence, more like something he was trying to distance himself from without letting go. And Evelyn reached forward then, not to take the paper, not to interrupt, but simply to adjust the candle in front of her, the flame flickering slightly as she moved it an inch to the side, the wax having begun to pool at the base, and the gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it grounded the moment in something tangible, something ordinary. And that contrast made everything else sharper, clearer, and Daniel watched that movement, the calm, the control, the absence of urgency, and it confirmed what he was now beginning to understand, that she had not reacted because she had not been surprised, and she had not been surprised because she had already seen the outcome, already understood the structure he had relied on, and more importantly, already positioned herself within it. And he exhaled slowly, his voice when he spoke again lower, more measured. "You knew," he said, not asking, not accusing, just stating, and Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unchanged, and gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emphatic, just enough, and that simple acknowledgement carried more weight than anything else that had been said that evening, because it rewrote the entire sequence of events, turning his decision into her timing, his control into her allowance, and the document in his hand into something he had not created, but completed for her. Daniel did not deny it when she nodded. And that was what made it settle fully, not just the words, not just the clause, but the quiet confirmation that everything he had believed was unfolding according to his plan had, in fact, been anticipated long before he stepped into the room, and he looked down at the document again, not searching now, not scanning, but holding it as if it might offer a different answer if he waited long enough. But the paper remained unchanged, the ink fixed, the language exact, and across from him, Evelyn sat with the same calm composure, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture relaxed, not defensive, not triumphant, simply present, and that absence of visible reaction began to press against him more than anything she could have said, because it left no clear target, no argument to counter, no emotion to challenge, only the quiet certainty that she understood something he had not, and around them, the room had drifted further back into its uneasy normal, conversations continuing in low tones, a few guests now fully committed to their plates, choosing focus over curiosity, but the awareness remained, subtle, persistent, like a current running beneath the surface, and Daniel exhaled slowly, placing the document flat on the table once more, this time not as a gesture of control, but as if acknowledging that it no longer belonged entirely to him, and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice again, though there was less control in it now, more effort. "You saw it before tonight," he said, repeating the point as if anchoring himself to something concrete, and Evelyn gave a small nod, her response immediate, unforced, "Yes," And she did not add anything to it because she did not need to. The simplicity of the answer carried enough weight, and Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in concentration. His mind moving through the possibilities, the timeline adjusting in real time, and he spoke again more carefully now. How? And it was a single word, but it carried the question he had not asked earlier, the one that mattered more than anything else, and Evelyn let a brief pause pass before answering, not because she needed time, but because she understood the value of timing, the way a moment could shape the meaning of what followed, and when she spoke, her tone remained even, almost conversational. "You left it open," she said, and the answer was simple, almost understated, but it landed with precision, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly, because that was not what he had expected. Not a hidden investigation, not a complicated explanation, just a small, ordinary oversight, something so basic it felt almost impossible to accept. And she continued, not elaborating, not expanding, just placing the next piece where it belonged, on your desk. And that was enough, the image forming immediately, the office, the papers, the moment he had stepped away, confident, certain that nothing needed to be guarded, because he believed the outcome was already decided. And that confidence had created the opening she needed, and Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze drifting briefly away from her as the sequence aligned in his mind. The preparation, the review, the signing, the presentation, and now this, the realization that the moment he believed he controlled had been visible long before he chose to reveal it. And Evelyn watched him quietly, not pressing, not correcting, because she did not need to guide him through it. He was already there, and she reached for her glass again, taking another small sip, the gesture steady, unhurried, and she set it down with the same care as before, maintaining that consistent rhythm that contrasted so sharply with the shift happening across from her. And Daniel looked back at her, his expression no longer carrying the same certainty, but something more measured, more aware, and he spoke again, this time not trying to assert control, but trying to understand it. "And you said nothing," he said, and Evelyn held his gaze, her answer coming without hesitation. "There was nothing to say," she replied, and that was the truth of it. Not silence as avoidance, not silence as weakness, but silence as decision, as timing, as control, and Daniel's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table now. No longer pressing, no longer tapping, just still, as if he were holding himself in place while everything else shifted around him. And the room continued its quiet movement. A soft laugh from somewhere down the table, the faint sound of a chair adjusting, ordinary life continuing in the background of something far more precise. And Evelyn leaned back slightly in her chair, not retreating, not distancing, simply settling, as if the moment had reached the point she had expected it to. And Daniel looked at the document one last time, then back at her, and in that exchange something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not resolution, but recognition, the understanding that the roles he had assigned at the beginning of the night no longer applied, that the control he believed he held had shifted, quietly, completely, and without resistance, and that the signature he had waited for had not ended the situation, it had completed something else entirely, something he had not fully seen until now, and by the time he understood it, the outcome was already in place. Daniel did not reach for the document again after that, and that absence of movement said more than anything else could have, because for the first time that evening he was no longer trying to control the outcome, he was trying to understand it. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked the point where everything had already changed, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or sudden reactions, but quietly, precisely, in the space between what he believed and what was actually true. And Evelyn watched him with the same steady calm she had held from the beginning, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if nothing about the moment required adjustment, because for her, it did not. It had already unfolded exactly as expected. And around them, the dinner continued to move forward, conversations growing slightly louder now, confidence returning in small increments as people allowed themselves to believe the tension had passed. But it had not passed, it had simply shifted. Inward, contained within the two of them, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting briefly across the table, taking in the room as if seeing it differently now, not as an audience to a decision he controlled, but as witnesses to something he no longer fully understood, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling, not in relief, but in acceptance of something he could not immediately change, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured, stripped of the certainty it had carried earlier. "So this was the plan," he said, not accusing, not even questioning, just acknowledging the possibility, and Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering the words, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, not dismissing him but correcting the framing. No, she said calmly. This was the outcome, and the distinction mattered, because it removed intent from the equation and replaced it with inevitability. And Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance but in thought, because he understood the difference, understood that a plan could be altered, interrupted, challenged, but an outcome, once set in motion, simply arrived. And he glanced once more at the document lying between them, no longer reaching for it, no longer needing to confirm what it contained, because he already knew. And he asked one final question, not out of strategy, not out of control, but because it was the only one left that mattered. What does it give you? He said, his tone even, almost neutral, and Evelyn looked at him for a moment, not answering immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of the answer, and when she spoke her voice remained soft, steady. It does not give me anything, she said, and then after a brief pause, it keeps what was already mine. And that was the moment it settled completely, not just the clause, not just the document, but the entire structure of what he had built, the realization that what he believed he was dividing had never been his to allocate in the way he assumed, that the foundation he stood on had been shaped long before he stepped into it. And Evelyn reached forward then, not for the document, not for the pen, but for the cake knife resting beside the plate, her movement calm, deliberate, and she cut a small slice from the edge of the cake, the blade moving smoothly through the soft layers, the sound quiet, almost gentle, and she placed the slice onto her plate with the same care she had shown in everything else, and that simple act, that return to something ordinary, grounded the moment in a way nothing else could, because it made clear what had just happened, not as an event that disrupted everything, but as something that had already been accounted for, already integrated into the flow of the evening. And Daniel watched her, not speaking, not interrupting, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to correct, only the understanding that the moment he had chosen to end something had instead revealed what had never been his to control. And Evelyn lifted her fork, taking a small measured bite, her expression unchanged, her posture composed, as if the evening could now continue exactly as planned. And in a way it could, just not according to the plan he had believed in. And as the conversations around them grew slightly louder, as the room settled into its new rhythm, Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the space between them where the document lay. And then he looked up again, not at the paper, not at the room, but at her, and in that look there was no longer assumption, no longer certainty, only recognition, the quiet understanding that the signature he had expected to end her position had instead confirmed it. And that realization, once seen, could not be undone, not tonight, not later, not at all.